The fog rolled in thick and silent, wrapping around the tombstones like a shroud. It was one of those nights when the air felt heavy, pressing down on your chest, and every sound was magnified 100 times. The crunch of my boots on the gravel path echoed through the cemetery, a stark reminder that I was alone in this place of the dead. My name is Alex, and I'm a paranormal investigator. I've spent years chasing ghosts, documenting haunted locations, and debunking myths. But tonight, something felt different. I wasn't here to debunk anything. I was here to confront a mystery that had haunted me since childhood. As a kid, I used to visit this graveyard with my grandfather. He was the caretaker, and he always told me stories about the restless spirits that wandered the grounds. His favorite tale was about the whispering shadows, a group of spirits that would gather in the dead of night to share their secrets. He claimed they only appeared to those who were truly alone and seeking answers. I never believed him, of course. I thought it was just his way of making sure I behaved while we were here. But after he passed away, strange things started happening. I would hear whispers in the night, see fleeting shadows from the corner of my eye, and feel an inexplicable chill whenever I visited his grave. Tonight, I decided to spend the night in the cemetery, hoping to uncover the truth behind the whispering shadows. Armed with a flashlight, a digital recorder, and my camera, I made my way to the oldest part of the graveyard, where my grandfather said the shadows were most active. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, creating a symphony of whispers that set my nerves on edge. I found a bench near a cluster of ancient graves and settled in, setting up my equipment and checking the batteries. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the worn inscriptions on the tombstones. As the hours passed, I recorded everything. The rustle of the wind, the occasional hoot of an owl, and my own whispered thoughts. Midnight came and went, and I began to wonder if this was just another wild goose chase. Maybe my grandfather's stories were just that, stories. Just as I was about to pack up and leave, I felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, so cold it felt like my bones were freezing. My breath came out in frosty puffs, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if a crowd had gathered around me, speaking in hushed tones. I turned on the digital recorder, my hands trembling. "If there are any spirits here, please make your presence known," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like a tornado of voices. I couldn't make out any specific words, just a cacophony of sound that seemed to seep into my very soul. I closed my eyes, trying to focus, trying to make sense of the chaos. And then, I heard it. A single voice, clear and distinct, cutting through the noise. "Alex." My eyes snapped open, and I swung the flashlight around, trying to find the source of the voice. The beam fell on a figure standing a few feet away, partially obscured by the fog. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his eyes glowing with an eerie light. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he turned and began to walk away, his movements slow and deliberate. I hesitated for a moment before following him, my flashlight casting long shadows that seemed to dance and twist in the mist. He led me deeper into the graveyard, to a section I had never been to before. The tombstones here were older, covered in moss and barely legible. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Finally, we stopped in front of a particularly decrepit grave. The figure turned to face me, his eyes boring into mine. "Dig," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. I dropped to my knees, using my hands to scrape away the dirt and debris. My fingers were numb from the cold, but I kept digging, driven by an inexplicable urge to uncover whatever lay beneath. After what felt like hours, my fingers hit something hard. I brushed away the remaining dirt to reveal a small, ornate box, its surface covered in strange symbols. I looked up at the figure, but he was gone. The whispers had stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the graveyard. With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside, there was a bundle of old letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible. As I read the first letter, my heart skipped a beat. The letters were from my grandfather, written to someone named Eleanor. They spoke of a forbidden love, of secrets buried deep within the graveyard, and of a pact made with the whispering shadows to keep their love alive, even in death. As I read the final letter, the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. My grandfather had been part of the whispering shadows, using their power to communicate with Eleanor long after she had passed away. He had hoped that I, his only living relative, would one day uncover the truth and help him find peace. Tears streamed down my face as I clutched the letters to my chest. I looked around the graveyard, half expecting to see my grandfather's ghost standing there, watching over me. But there was nothing, just the cold, silent night and the lingering sense of loss. I carefully placed the letters back in the box and buried it once more, saying a silent prayer for my grandfather and Eleanor. As I stood up, I felt a warmth wash over me, chasing away the chill. The whispers were gone, replaced by a sense of calm and peace. I left the graveyard that night with a new understanding of the whispering shadows. They weren't malevolent spirits, but souls bound by love and secrets, seeking only to be remembered and understood. And as I walked away, I knew that my grandfather had finally found the peace he had been searching for, and that his story and the story of the whispering shadows would live on through me. The old graveyard on the outskirts of town had always been shrouded in mystery and dread. As children, we dared each other to venture into its depths after dark, but none of us ever had the courage to go further than the rusted iron gates. Tales of ghosts and vengeful spirits were enough to keep us at bay. Now, as an adult, I found myself irresistibly drawn back to the place that had haunted my dreams for so many years. My name is Sarah, and I am a journalist specializing in local legends and haunted places. I had returned to my hometown to investigate the stories surrounding the graveyard, driven by a mixture of nostalgia and professional curiosity. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the keeper's curse, a tale about a graveyard keeper who was said to have gone mad and cursed the land before disappearing without a trace. Armed with a camera, a notebook, and a flashlight, I made my way to the graveyard one cold, moonless night. The air was thick with fog, and the silence was oppressive. I pushed open the creaking gate and stepped inside, the gravel crunching under my boots like the bones of the long dead. The graveyard was even more eerie than I remembered. The tombstones, worn and weathered by time, jutted out of the ground at odd angles. The trees, twisted and gnarled, cast long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around me, and began my exploration. I wandered through the rows of graves, reading the inscriptions and taking notes. The stories I had heard began to seem less like tall tales and more like echoes of a dark past. There were accounts of strange lights, disembodied voices, and figures that vanished when approached. But the most persistent legend was that of the keeper himself. According to the stories, The keeper was a recluse who had lived in a small cottage at the edge of the graveyard. He was responsible for maintaining the grounds and watching over the dead. But one day, something changed. He began talking to himself, digging up graves at night, and claiming that the dead were speaking to him. The townspeople grew fearful and avoided the graveyard entirely. Then, one night, the keeper vanished, leaving behind only a cryptic note that spoke of a curse and a promise to return. As I ventured deeper into the graveyard, I found myself standing before the old caretaker's cottage. It was a dilapidated structure, half hidden by ivy and surrounded by a wrought iron fence. The door hung ajar, and the windows were dark and empty. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the flashlight switch before stepping inside. The interior was as decrepit as the exterior. Dust covered every surface, and the air was stale and suffocating. The furniture was overturned, and papers were scattered across the floor. I sifted through the debris, looking for anything that might shed light on the keeper's fate. In the corner of the room, I found a leather-bound journal. It was the keeper's diary, filled with ramblings about the voices he heard and the visions he saw. As I read, a picture began to emerge of a man slowly losing his grip on reality, consumed by the belief that the dead were reaching out to him. The final entry sent chills down my spine. It spoke of a ritual, a way to bind the spirits and keep them from tormenting the living. The keeper had believed that by performing this ritual, he could protect the town from the restless dead. But something had gone wrong, and instead of banishing the spirits, he had unleashed something far worse. As I finished reading, a sudden noise startled me. It was a low, guttural growl coming from outside the cottage. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window, but saw nothing. The sound came again, closer this time, sending my heart racing. I bolted from the cottage, my flashlight beam dancing wildly over the tombstones. The growling grew louder, echoing through the graveyard like the roar of some monstrous beast. Desperation fueled my actions as I crawled towards the flashlight. I grabbed it and turned it on, illuminating the figure standing before me. It was the keeper, or what was left of him. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his body was twisted and deformed, as if he had been torn apart and stitched back together by some unholy force. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper that cut through the night. I backed away, my mind racing. "What happened to you?" "The ritual," he replied, his eyes locking onto mine. "I tried to save them, but I failed. The curse, it's real. And now, you're part of it." I felt a cold hand grasp my ankle, and I screamed, kicking wildly. The ground seemed to open up beneath me, and I was pulled into a dark, suffocating void. The keeper's face loomed over me, his expression a twisted mask of sorrow and rage. "You must finish what I started," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. "Only then can the curse be lifted." The world around me spun, and I lost consciousness. When I awoke, I was lying on the ground in front of the cottage. The fog had lifted, and the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. I felt a strange sense of clarity, as if the night's events had opened my eyes to a hidden truth. I knew what I had to do. The keeper's journal held the key to ending the curse, and I was determined to see it through. I spent the next few days gathering the necessary materials and preparing for the ritual. On the night of the full moon, I returned to the graveyard. The air was thick with anticipation, and the whispers of the dead seemed to guide me to the spot where the ritual was to be performed. I followed the instructions in the journal, chanting the ancient words and making the required offerings. As I completed the final incantation, A surge of energy pulsed through the graveyard. The ground trembled, and the air crackled with electricity. The spirits of the dead began to materialize, their forms shimmering like ghostly apparitions. The keeper appeared before me, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You have done it," he said. "The curse is lifted. The dead can finally rest." I watched as the spirits faded away, their whispers growing fainter until they were gone entirely. The graveyard, once a place of fear and darkness, now felt peaceful and serene. I left the graveyard that night with a sense of closure and a newfound respect for the power of the unknown. The keeper's curse had been broken, and the dead could finally rest in peace. And as for me, I knew that my journey into the world of the supernatural was only just beginning. The sky was a slate-gray canvas, thick with clouds that seemed to press down on the world below. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, and the distant rumble of thunder hinted at an approaching storm. I stood at the entrance of the old St. Bartholomew's Cemetery, my flashlight flickering as if it too sensed the unease that permeated the place. My name is Daniel, and I'm a historian with a particular interest in local legends and folklore. St. Bartholomew's was a place I had read about in countless books, each describing it as the final resting place of the restless dead. The most intriguing legend was that of the Silent Bell, a mysterious phenomenon that was said to occur only during the darkest storms. The story went that a bell, once used to call mourners to funeral services, had been removed from the church's bell tower after it rang inexplicably during a funeral decades ago. The bell was buried somewhere in the graveyard, and ever since, during violent storms, its ghostly toll could be heard echoing through the night, heralding the presence of the dead. Tonight, with a storm brewing on the horizon, I had come to see if there was any truth to the tale. Armed with my flashlight, a recorder, and my notebook, I pushed open the creaking iron gate and stepped into the graveyard. The wind howled through the trees, their skeletal branches reaching out like the gnarled fingers of the dead. I made my way through the maze of tombstones, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The names and dates etched into the stones were barely legible, worn away by time and weather. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were following my every move. The storm broke just as I reached the heart of the cemetery. Rain fell in torrents, drenching me in seconds and turning the ground into a muddy quagmire. Lightning flashed, illuminating the landscape in stark, ghostly white, and thunder roared like the wrath of an angry god. I found shelter beneath a large oak tree, its twisted branches providing a modicum of protection from the rain. I set up my recorder, hoping to capture the sound of the bell if it rang. As the minutes ticked by, the storm grew more intense, the wind howling and the rain lashing down with relentless fury. And then, I heard it. Faint at first, almost drowned out by the storm, but unmistakable. The tolling of a bell, deep and resonant, echoing through the graveyard. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear it more clearly, each peal sending shivers down my spine. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere to my left, near a cluster of ancient, crumbling mausoleums. I grabbed my flashlight and recorder and trudged through the mud, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The bell continued to ring, each toll growing louder and more insistent. I reached the mausoleums and found myself standing before an old, weathered crypt. The entrance was partially open, the heavy stone door ajar as if inviting me in. The bell's tolling seemed to emanate from within, beckoning me closer. I hesitated, a deep sense of foreboding settling over me, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I stepped inside the crypt, the air damp and musty. The walls were lined with niches, each holding the remains of someone long dead. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the stone walls. The bell's tolling was deafening now, reverberating through the crypt like the heartbeat of some ancient, malevolent entity. At the far end of the crypt, I saw it, a large, ornate bell, half buried in the dirt. Its surface was tarnished and covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light. I approached it slowly, my heart in my throat. The closer I got, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if I were standing on the precipice of some terrible revelation. As I reached out to touch the bell, a cold hand grasped my wrist. I gasped and turned, coming face to face with a spectral figure. It was a woman, her eyes hollow and her face twisted in sorrow. She was dressed in a tattered funeral gown, her hair hanging in wet, tangled strands. "Leave this place," she whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. "The bell tolls for the living as well as the dead." I tried to pull away, but her grip was like iron. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. "I am Eleanor," she replied, her eyes boring into mine. "I was buried here long ago, but my spirit cannot rest. The bell binds us to this place, and it will claim you too if you do not leave." Panic surged through me, and I wrenched my arm free, stumbling back towards the entrance of the crypt. The bell's tolling grew frantic, almost desperate, as if it were trying to warn me of something terrible. I turned and ran, the spectral figure's mournful wails following me into the storm. I didn't stop running until I was out of the graveyard and back on the main road, my chest heaving and my clothes soaked through. The bell's tolling had ceased, replaced by the steady patter of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. I collapsed against a tree, my mind racing with the night's events. I had come seeking a story, a legend to debunk or verify, but what I had found was something far more sinister. The silent bell was no mere legend. It was a warning, a curse that bound the dead to the graveyard and threatened to claim the living as well. In the days that followed, I researched Eleanor's story and discovered that she had been buried in the cemetery after a tragic accident. Her fiancé, overcome with grief, had commissioned the bell to be placed in her crypt as a symbol of their eternal love. But the bell had become something more, a conduit for the restless spirits that roamed St. Bartholomew's. I never returned to the graveyard after that night, but the memory of the silent bell and Eleanor's sorrowful gaze haunts me still. The bell's tolling, a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, echoes in my dreams, a ghostly warning that some legends are best left undisturbed. The night was cold, and the moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the old cemetery. The wind rustled the leaves, creating a symphony of whispers that seemed to beckon me deeper into the heart of the graveyard. My name is Emma, and I am a writer specializing in supernatural fiction. I had come to this graveyard in search of inspiration, lured by tales of a forgotten grave said to hold a terrible secret. The cemetery was known as Blackwood Cemetery, a place abandoned for decades, overrun with weeds and encroaching trees. Legends told of a grave, unmarked and hidden, where a man known only as the keeper had been buried alive for his sins. It was said that those who found the grave would be cursed, haunted by the keeper's restless spirit until they too joined him in the earth. Armed with only a flashlight, a notebook, and my camera, I ventured into the cemetery, determined to find the grave and uncover the truth. The path was overgrown, the tombstones cracked and weathered by time. The further I went, the more I felt a growing sense of unease, as if unseen eyes were watching me from the shadows. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like the mournful wails of the dead. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around me as I pressed on. I had been walking for what felt like hours when I stumbled upon a clearing, a circular patch of ground free of tombstones and overgrowth. At its center was a mound of earth, covered in tangled vines and moss. This had to be it, the forgotten grave. I approached the mound cautiously, my flashlight beam piercing the darkness. The ground around it was uneven, as if it had been disturbed recently. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt down and began to clear away the vines and dirt. As I worked, a strange feeling washed over me, a sense of dread so intense that it made my skin crawl. After what felt like an eternity, I uncovered a wooden plaque, its surface worn and barely legible. I wiped away the dirt and leaves, revealing the words carved into the wood. "Here lies the keeper, condemned for his sins. May his soul find no rest." I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. The legend was true. I had found the keeper's grave. But what were his sins, and why had he been buried alive? As I pondered these questions, a cold gust of wind blew through the clearing, extinguishing my flashlight and plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn the flashlight back on. When the beam finally flickered to life, I saw him, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, shrouded in shadow. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his presence exuded a palpable sense of malevolence. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure stepped forward, and I could see him more clearly now. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his face gaunt and hollow, as if he had been starved for years. "I am the keeper," he said, his voice a raspy whisper that sent chills down my spine. "And you have disturbed my rest." "I didn't mean to," I stammered, backing away. "I just wanted to know the truth." "The truth?" The keeper's eyes flashed with anger. "The truth is that I was cursed, buried alive for sins I did not commit. And now, I am doomed to wander this graveyard, seeking vengeance on those who disturb my grave." "I'm sorry," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "I didn't know." "It is too late for apologies," the keeper said, his voice growing colder. "You have awakened me, and now you must pay the price." Before I could react, the ground beneath me began to shake. The mound of earth at the center of the clearing shifted, and skeletal hands burst forth from the soil, clawing at the air. I screamed and turned to run, but the keeper was already upon me, his cold, bony fingers wrapping around my wrist. "You cannot escape," he hissed. "The curse is now yours." I struggled against his grip, but it was like iron. The ground continued to heave, and more skeletal hands emerged, reaching for me with a malevolent hunger. In a last desperate act, I kicked out at the keeper, breaking free from his grasp and stumbling towards the edge of the clearing. I didn't stop running until I was out of the graveyard and back on the main road, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The keeper's curse hung heavy over me, a dark cloud that would not dissipate. I knew that I could never return to Blackwood Cemetery, but the memory of that night would haunt me forever. In the days that followed, I researched the keeper's story and discovered that he had been wrongfully accused of witchcraft and murder. The townspeople, consumed by fear and superstition, had condemned him to a horrific fate. His spirit, fueled by injustice and rage, now sought vengeance on anyone who disturbed his grave. I never spoke of that night to anyone, but the experience changed me. I no longer sought out haunted places or pursued tales of the supernatural. The curse of the keeper was a constant reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the terrible price of disturbing what should remain buried. And so, I live with the keeper's curse, knowing that one day, he will come for me. The whispers of the dead follow me wherever I go, and in the darkest corners of my mind, I hear the keeper's voice, promising that I will join him in his eternal, restless torment. The dense fog rolled in, blanketing the old Willow Creek Cemetery in an ethereal shroud. The moon, a pale orb, barely penetrated the thick mist, casting ghostly glimmers that danced across the gravestones. My name is Mark, and as a paranormal investigator, I've explored countless haunted places. Yet, Willow Creek had a reputation that sent shivers down even my spine. Legends spoke of the lantern bearer, a spectral figure who wandered the cemetery, his lantern glowing with an otherworldly light. It was said that those who followed the lantern bearer never returned, swallowed by the darkness he roamed. Tonight, I was determined to uncover the truth behind the tale. With a flashlight, a digital recorder, and my trusty camera, I stepped through the wrought iron gates of Willow Creek. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and earth. My footsteps echoed ominously in the silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The cemetery was vast, a sprawling expanse of weathered tombstones and ancient crypts. I moved cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog, illuminating the names and dates etched into the stones. Some graves were so old that the inscriptions had faded into obscurity, leaving only the cold, silent reminders of those who lay beneath. As I ventured deeper into the graveyard, the fog thickened, and the temperature seemed to drop. My breath formed visible puffs in the air, and I pulled my coat tighter around me. It was then that I saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance. My heart quickened, and I knew it had to be the lantern bearer. I followed the light, moving as quietly as possible, my senses on high alert. The lantern's glow grew brighter, casting eerie shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in the mist. As I approached, I could make out the figure holding the lantern. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in tattered clothes that flapped in the cold breeze. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his eyes, two pinpoints of pale, ghostly light, pierced through the darkness. He turned and began to walk, the lantern swinging gently in his hand. Compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity, I followed. The graveyard seemed to stretch endlessly, the tombstones blurring together in the fog. I lost track of time, my focus entirely on the lantern bearer's glowing beacon. Suddenly, the figure stopped and turned to face me. The light from the lantern illuminated his face, and I gasped. His features were skeletal, his skin stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity. He raised a bony hand and pointed to a grave at his feet. I approached cautiously, my flashlight revealing a tombstone covered in thick vines. I knelt down, brushing the foliage aside to read the inscription. The name was illegible, worn away by time, but the date was clear, 1798. My fingers traced the cold stone, and I felt a strange energy pulse beneath my touch. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The lantern bearer did not speak, but I felt his answer resonate in my mind. He was a guardian, cursed to wander the cemetery for eternity, guiding lost souls to their final rest. But there was more, a deep sadness and anger that seemed to emanate from him. I stood up and looked into his glowing eyes. "How can I help you?" He pointed again, this time towards a distant crypt. Understanding dawned on me. He wanted me to follow him there. As we walked, the fog seemed to part before us, the shadows retreating as if in fear of the lantern bearer. The crypt was old and crumbling, its entrance blocked by heavy iron bars. With a surprising ease, the lantern bearer lifted the bars and beckoned me inside. The air within was musty and stale, thick with the scent of decay. My flashlight beam revealed stone steps leading down into the darkness. We descended into the crypt, the lantern bearer's light casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. At the bottom, we entered a small chamber. In the center lay a stone sarcophagus, its lid slightly askew. The lantern bearer pointed to it, his eyes burning with urgency. I hesitated, but my curiosity outweighed my fear. I pushed the lid aside, revealing a set of old, brittle bones. Among the bones was a small, leather-bound journal. I picked it up, the pages crumbling at my touch. Carefully, I began to read. The journal belonged to a man named Edward Blackwood, the original caretaker of Willow Creek Cemetery. His final entries were filled with desperation and terror. He spoke of a dark presence that haunted the graveyard, a malevolent force that sought to claim the souls of the dead. Edward had discovered a way to bind the entity, but in doing so, he had condemned himself to an eternity as the lantern bearer, the guardian of the graveyard. As I finished reading, the lantern bearer stepped forward, his form shimmering like a mirage. He reached out and touched the journal, and I understood what he wanted. He needed me to perform the ritual described in the final pages, to free him from his eternal torment. With trembling hands, I followed the instructions. I gathered the required items from the crypt: candles, a silver dagger, and a vial of salt. I arranged them around the sarcophagus and began to chant the incantation written in the journal. The air grew thick with energy, and the ground trembled beneath my feet. The lantern bearer stood at the edge of the circle, his eyes fixed on me, a silent plea in their ghostly depths. As I spoke the final words, a blinding light filled the chamber, and I felt a powerful force surge through me. When the light faded, the lantern bearer was gone. In his place stood a man, his eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. "You have freed me." Before I could respond, he faded away, leaving me alone in the crypt. The oppressive weight of the graveyard lifted, and I felt a profound sense of peace settle over the place. I left Willow Creek Cemetery that night, my heart lighter than it had been in years. The lantern bearer's curse was broken, and his soul finally at rest. As I walked away, the fog began to clear, and the first light of dawn touched the horizon. The experience changed me. I no longer sought out the supernatural with the same reckless curiosity. I had seen the toll it could take, the pain and suffering it could cause. The lantern bearer's story was a reminder that some legends are rooted in truth, and some spirits are not at peace. And so, I continue my work, but with a newfound respect for the dead and the restless souls who walk among us. The lantern bearer's light may have guided him to his final rest, but it also illuminated a path for me, one that I will follow with caution and reverence.